Hi, everybody. I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of The Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. Please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness, which is a historical fiction tracing the story of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we'll be speaking with Barrie Schwortz. He's one of the preeminent researchers on the Shroud of Turin. For those of you that are familiar with STURP, he was one of the team members that were able to research the Shroud in the Royal Palace in Turin, Italy in 1978. But before we get started, I wanted to tell a short story. I used to live in Germany, and one of the most impressive things I have ever experienced was my visit to the Dachau concentration camps right outside of Munich, Germany. Now, by impressive, I don't mean positive. I mean, it made this incredible impression on me. And it's more akin to the German translation imponierend. And it made this impression on me in an incredibly negative way. And be honest with you, I will never, ever go back. I can barely look at a movie on any of the visits that people take or show on Auschwitz or Birkenau or Dachau or wherever it happens to be. Well, viewing the Shroud for me is similarly impressive, both negatively and positively. The Shroud shows and witnesses the scourging with the flagrum over 100 times, the suffering, the wounds, and then lastly, the death, probably by asphyxiation, but it could have been something else as well. On the positive side, though, the Shroud, assuming its authenticity, is the only witness to the resurrection. It is the most studied artifact in the world, and it's these two reasons that led to the effort expended on understanding this truly wondrous relic, both by STURP and by scientists around the world. So let me welcome Barrie Schwortz. He's, of course, an amazing photographer, and that's kind of how he started in this business. But he was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project, also known as STURP. STURP is the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the Shroud in 1978. Today, he plays an influential role in Shroud research and education as the editor and founder of the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website, which is www.shroud.com. It is one of the oldest, largest, and most extensive Shroud resources on the internet, with more than 15 million visitors from over 160 countries. So in 2009, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, also known as STERA, a nonprofit 501(c) corporation to which he donated the website and his extensive Shroud photographic collection, as well as many other important Shroud resources, in order to preserve and maintain these materials and make them available for future research and study. He currently serves as the president of STERA, Inc. Barrie, welcome, and so good to have you today with me.
It's my pleasure to be here, Guy. I'm glad to be able to participate with you in your new venture of doing these podcasts.
Yeah, thank you, Barrie, and I'm really looking forward to doing this with you and also with others. So tell us more about the story of how you got involved in the Shroud originally.
Well, back in the 1970s, I was in Santa Barbara, California, and I operated a commercial photographic studio, but primarily focused more, we did advertising and that kind of thing, but a lot of my work was scientific, medical, or technical, and I worked with organizations like Raytheon and GM Delco and Burroughs and many of the medical device manufacturing companies. So I had a pretty strong technical background. And then I was approached in, I guess this would have been 1975, mid-late 1975, by a company in Santa Barbara that was a contractor to Los Alamos National Laboratories. And they had a project where they needed a photographic consultant, someone who had access to a darkroom and had darkroom skills, to produce 5 books of images from what was then highly classified motion picture films of above ground atomic explosions, mushroom clouds. And what they found was, because they had these amazing computers at that time, beyond what any of the rest of us could even imagine then, big Cray water-cooled monsters, they were able to extract new data from these old unclassified films. They had to reclassify the films. And so they needed to extract this information. I had to, in the dark room, superimpose kilometer scales and all kind of other information. And then these books were presented to what was then the Atomic Energy Commission, now the DOE, Department of Energy, and all the military groups. So I did that project. It lasted 7 months. And I worked with a gentleman named Don Devan. Well, a few weeks after we finished, the phone rang again, and it was Don Devan again. And when you're self-employed and the phone rings, you're always praying, hey, that's the next job, I hope. And so Don called me up and he said, no, he said, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I laughed. I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed and said, so am I, remember? Don was one of the other Jewish members of our team. And he explained to me that he and a number of other researchers from Los Alamos and Sandia Labs had taken a device called a VP8 image analyzer, which you input a black and white with a black and white video camera, and it displays the results on a green screen monitor. And what it does is it takes the lights and darks of the image and stretches them into 3D space proportionate to each other. Well, if you go back to the early parts of the 20th century, Shroud scholars then were predicting that there might be some depth or spatial or 3D information encoded in the image, but they had no way to prove it. In the 1960s, a photographer and artist named Leo Valla projected an image onto a block of clay and sculpted a 3D face of the man of the shroud, which turns out was quite accurate. But in 1976, when they submitted a photograph of the shroud to this device, that was the first time in history that a scientific instrument confirmed that there was spatial or depth or 3D information encoded into the density of the shroud image. And as soon as I saw that, I knew, well, it can't be a photograph or an artwork, because we photographers can't do that. We can imply depth with highlights and shadows, but we're not encoding any distance information in our photographs. So that caught my interest. So when he explained to me that they were looking for a photographer, they're going to put a team together, he said, would you like to be a part of that? And I said, no, I didn't want to get involved. And he assured me that it was science. And so I kind of relented. I was very curious about that image property, but to be very candid, I was also thinking, free trip to Italy. So
good wine.
Yeah, well, I'd never been to Europe, and this was an opportunity. So I said yes. But a few weeks later, two other gentlemen joined we worked in regional groups. I was in California at the time. And so two gentlemen from the Jet Propulsion Lab joined our team. Don Lynn, who was head of imaging on Voyager, Viking, Mariner, and Galileo projects, and John Lohr. And Don Lynn was a good Catholic man. And a couple of weeks into it, I was again feeling, maybe I shouldn't be a part of this. It seemed so far above me. I wasn't a scientist, as you know, some of these guys were just amazing scientists. And I remember saying, maybe I shouldn't be a part of this. And Don Lynn, my hero from the JPL, looked at me and he said, have you forgotten that the man in question is a Jew? And I said, no, I knew that. And he says, oh, you don't think God wants one of his chosen people on our team? And I laughed and I said, no, I never thought that. And he said, listen, stop complaining, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know. That's what kept me on the team. And here it is 43 years later, and I'm still doing it. So that was what brought me on board the Shroud of Turin research project.
Wow. Yeah, interesting story. And 43 years later, how it has changed so many lives, and certainly including yours, and I'm sure everybody that was on the STURP team. Wow. So tell us, what was it actually like in the Royal Palace there in Turin?
Well, you know, people immediately think of a scientific examination. They think of a laboratory with stainless steel tables and, you know, white enameled stuff and beakers. And this is a 400-year-old creaky old building, kind of musty, tapestries hanging on the walls that were 400 years old, So dust was an issue. There were frescoes on the ceiling, and every time a truck or a bus went by the palace, the building would vibrate and you could see the particulates sort of floating down. It was not the best, but it was what we were given to do, and we adapted. What amazed me, and I can say this, speaking of my fellow team members, even though I've worked with scientists and researchers over the years, I had never met a more dedicated group of empirical people than this group of scientists. They absolutely were dedicated to doing this. So they sat, and we spent 17 months in advance of going to Turin just to plan out our experiments that were all put into a test plan that was submitted to the then owner of the shroud, King Umberto, who was legally the owner at that time. And it was King Umberto who gave us permission to examine the shroud, not the Catholic Church, because it wasn't owned by the Catholic Church. It was owned by the king. And so the people in Turin were known as the custodians of the shroud. And so when King Umberto gave us the yes, go ahead, people in Turin weren't too thrilled because they'd been studying the shroud for years. They'd never been given this kind of access and permission. And suddenly this group of American scientists from big name laboratories so that there was a certain level of resentment, which I understand, that they didn't feel too thrilled about having us there. But I mean, they were lobbying to stop us until the shroud was brought in the room. But in the end, that didn't stop us. And considering during that 17-month period, they had to anticipate every possible problem that might be encountered and be prepared to deal with those problems should they arise. And sure enough, a number of them almost on a daily basis did. And the thoroughness of their preparation still amazes me at how they were able to anticipate what possibly could go wrong and provide a way of dealing with that should it should arrive. One of the best examples is the steel table that we used that was constructed specifically for this purpose to attach the shroud to it with magnets so it wouldn't damage the cloth with pinholes or clamps or something like that. And once the table arrived in Turin, they found that it had oxidized, that the steel had a white powdery surface on it that would come off. You could rub it off on your hands, and obviously couldn't put the shroud on that. They anticipated that, and they brought with them, remember we had two guys from NASA, they brought several rolls of gold foil mylar, the same stuff that you've seen inside the cargo bay of the space shuttle or on satellites, very expensive stuff. And we had to cover the panels of our table with that gold foil mylar. But the fact that they anticipated that could be a problem and brought a solution with us, sure enough, that we needed to use. I mean, that just is a small example of how thorough their planning was to go and do this. This wasn't just a bunch of guys going, okay, let's hop in an airplane and go look at the shroud. This was the most thorough examination and planning of any scientific project that I've ever been a part of.
So a real tough question for you then.
Sure.
So you were there 120 hours. Did
Correct.
they plan sleep for anybody, or was everybody awake the whole time?
Well, being the only documenting photographer, I slept, let's see, we were there 120 hours, and I was in the room approximately 113 hours. I did have to go back to the hotel and take a shower and get an hour or two sleep on one or two occasions. So I wasn't there. And sadly, because of that, I did miss documenting one of the experiments in depth the way I did all the others. And that to this day, I kind of have regrets of that, but you know, you can only stay awake for so long.
Yep.
And especially when you're in in another culture, another country, different languages. We didn't get to enjoy much of Turin, but what we did do is an amazing examination of that amazing piece of cloth.
Yeah, it's really impressive. So, and out of that, what do you think is the one most valuable outcome that came out of that?
Well, I think if I were to look at everything that we did, I think maybe the most important single piece of information is the fact that we found no traces of paint, pigments, binders, or any kind of artistic medium that might lead to this being some kind of an artwork. And the same is true of photography. because there was a belief that some of the silver that when it was in a fire in 1532, that some of the silver from the casket it was in may have dripped onto the cloth, burning some of those holes. We were also looking for silver, and that was a double-edged sword, because if the shroud were made photographically, which some people suggested, then we would have found silver all over the cloth, more so in the image, less so in the outer, outside of the image. We found zero silver except for one microscopic, literally microscopic bead of what apparently had been molten silver, perhaps again from that fire. That's the only silver we found anywhere. So there's one or two gentlemen out there, people out there who claim the shroud is made photographically, and they don't understand that when you fix a photographic image, it removes all the unused silver, and what remains is the silver that forms the image. So if the shroud had been made photographically, we would have found silver everywhere. And since that theory is that they soaked the cloth in a silver solution, it would have penetrated into the fibers. It would have been overwhelming in the amount of silver we'd have found. We found zero silver. So it's not a photographic image, although it has one or two properties like a photograph, but it has other properties unlike any photograph ever made.
Well, that 3D imaging story that you told about the VP8, that kind of goes totally against what you would otherwise get in a regular photograph, in a 2D photograph.
Yeah, so, in my presentations, I actually show a VP8 image of a couple of kids just to show you the difference. And of course, it's all distorted and flat, and you don't get any natural relief of a human form, which is what you got on the VP8 with the shroud image. It's the actual relief of a human form, like a bas relief. And so we know that there was some interaction between a cloth and the body to form that image. We still don't know the mechanism. That was our intent. Our primary purpose, answer the question, how is the image formed? In the end, we couldn't come up with an answer, because if you get the chemistry right, the physics is wrong. You get the physics right, the chemistry is wrong. So we came back unable to answer that question. And of course, we came back with 1,000 new questions too. So
that's always the way it is, isn't it?
Always the way it is, but that's how science works.
Yeah. Well, so you were in the presence of the shroud in that room in the Royal Palace. So what was it like in there? What kind of feelings came to you as you were in there?
Well, I think if you look at the actual story of what happened, when we arrived in Turin a week early, before the end of the public exhibition, which was commemorating the 400th anniversary of it being in Turin, 1578 to 1978. So we got there, and it was still on public display. And our goal was to be able to take our time, unpack the equipment, set it up, calibrate everything, and have a week of preparation before the shroud was actually taken off public display and brought to us for examination. We got there, and we found out upon arrival that all 80 crates of our equipment had been seized by Italian customs, and they weren't going to let it loose. And we found out later that the reason was we had an X-ray machine with us, a very low power X-ray. And unfortunately, on the outside of the crate, they had to put a radiation sticker because it's an X-ray machine. And that apparently put the fear of God into the Italian customs folks. So they seized their equipment. It took like 5.5 days of negotiations. And I don't know if this is true or not, but rumor has it that the Archbishop of Turin put the cathedral up as collateral to let our equipment loose. I don't know if it's true or not. I have never been able to verify that myself, but that was the story, that apparently the Archbishop went and spoke to the customs folks, and then they eventually released it to us. But it was now down to like a day and a half prior to the end of the public exhibition when they were going to bring us the shroud. So from that moment forward, when the equipment arrived on a dump truck, of all things, to the Royal Palace, we had to then unload all the equipment and take it up a couple of flights of steps up to where we were going to do the exam, and unpack all these wooden crates and pull out the instruments and start to calibrate. We didn't sleep for that day and a half at all. We literally worked around the clock, and they brought us the shroud. We were still getting our equipment finalized and covering those panels of the table. We hadn't even finished covering those panels of the table with Mylar when the shroud was laid out before us.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you actually then, it was not only 120 hours, it was a couple of days in addition to that as you were getting set up.
Absolutely.
And then
Absolutely.
the stress and everything. Oh man. So let me change subjects a little bit on you there. And one of the significant events that took place was with the Shroud was with Secondo Pia. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, in 1898, an Italian lawyer who was also I guess we'd call him an amateur photographer. When back in 1898, there weren't that many amateur photographers, obviously, using a large view camera, the kind that you have to put a dark cloth and look the image upside down on a ground glass back. He was given the opportunity to make the first actual photographs, authorized photographs of the Shroud. And the problem was, even though there was electricity in the Royal Palace in 1898, it was a palace after all, it fluctuated. And so the lighting he was using fluctuated along with the voltage in the palace. And his first set of exposures were wrong. And he had to go back a second time. He had to climb a scaffolding with his monstrous big camera, as big as me. He had to photograph the Shroud through glass, which means he had to deal with the surface reflections on the glass. And, and he was not working with, the high quality photographic technology that we had in 1978. He was working with what was then very new technology, and he managed to make these first photographs. And of course, we always look at that moment as the beginning of the scientific era of study of the Shroud, because for the first time ever, people outside of the northern part of Italy, where Turin is in the Piedmont district, for the first time, people outside of that area could actually see this object, and they could reproduce it in publications, books, and magazines by then. And that's when the real interest in the Shroud globally began. Now, again, it was still reasonably restricted because nobody had ever done an examination of it. But there were researchers in France and, of course, in Italy who were already avidly studying the Shroud. Pierre Barbet, the medical doctor who wrote, what's it called? Something at Calvary. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of his book. A Doctor at Calvary, I believe. Anyway, that was the first time that a medical expert had looked at the Shroud and said, look, this is authentic. This is a real body. This isn't an artwork. The blood flows have been determined to be actual real blood flows, not painted on, as some of the skeptics have said. Because look, a forensic pathologist who deals with crimes every day knows what looks real and what's fake. And Buckland, who was also a forensic pathologist, Dr. Buckland, who was on our team, he's the guy they based the TV show Quincy on. And he was an advisor to the Quincy producers for that program. So we had really credible experts on our team, not just a bunch of guys who wanted to go, look at the Shroud, but people who had the qualifications to perform the kind of tests that were necessary for us to try and determine how that image was formed.
Yeah, just amazing. So just curious, are those plates from Secondo Pia, are they still existent, or are they been lost now? Or
no, they're still in existence. Of course, they're archived and put away to be preserved, and duplicates of those, which you couldn't tell the difference unless you're an expert, duplicates of those plates are on display at the Shroud Museum in Turin.
And are those...
As is the camera, by the way.
And are those plates the same resolution as what you have today, or would you think that they're...
No. The technology's evolved dramatically since then. And of course, we're talking about photography, and we're talking about film. And I'll tell you how things have changed. I was some years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I was in Canada lecturing to school kids, 5th, 6th, 7th graders, something like that, 12, 13-year-olds. And a kid put up his hand. He said, "Excuse me, Mr. Schwartz, you keep talking about film. Is that a USB device?" And what that shows you is just how much has changed in a very short period of time. There was a time where you couldn't walk down any street anywhere on the planet without seeing a yellow Kodak sign somewhere. Well, I was in Jerusalem in 2013, and in the old city, and I saw a little shop and had a Kodak sign. I made a photograph of the Kodak sign, realizing we're not going to be seeing those much anymore.
Yeah,
And of
yeah.
course,
My
now
dad,
they're gone.
yeah, yeah. My dad bought stock in Polaroid, so
Well,
way
that
early
wasn't,
on when it first came out.
yeah, well, that wouldn't have been a bad idea at the time, but
Yeah,
now, of
yeah,
course, that's obsolete as well.
yeah. Exactly,
All
exactly.
digital now. And, you know, a 10 or a 12-year-old kid, if you think back, what he can remember back to when he was 5 or 6 years old, he wouldn't know what film is because film isn't used anymore except on very rare occasions. And in the fine art photography area, they're still making certain films and papers because fine art photographers are still making prints the analog method. But almost everything else is digital. And look, digital was not viable until they made image sensors that had higher resolution than the best films we had in 1978.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah,
nowadays we can do, you know, we have 50 and 100 megapixel image sensors, Hasselblad cameras, perfect example, which are way better than anything we could do on film.
And you can stitch them together to get like multi-hundred or multi-thousand megabyte images. It's pretty impressive.
Just as an example, we make a life-size replica, as you know. The file that's made from is 400 megabytes. And that's why the details are all there, because of the resolution that we have. And my photographs of the shroud, I photograph half the shroud at a time, the ventral image and the dorsal image separately with some overlap. 20 years later, when I put them in Photoshop, put them together, only took a few minutes, and we created that 400 megabyte image from which we can make life-size images of the shroud with beautiful resolution.
They are incredible. They are. When I saw the one that you sent me, it is as impressive as I was talking about you know, Dachau, except now in the positive sense, and just absolutely impressive.
What's interesting is that when you go to Turin to see the actual shroud on display, you're never any closer than about 3 or 4 meters from it, and you're looking through big, thick, bulletproof glass. People have problems because they bring their phones and try and take pictures of the shroud. And the infrared sensor in your phone, the focusing mechanism, bounces off the surface glass, and you quite can't get it in focus because you've got a few inches of that glass in front of the shroud, and it's reflecting and measuring off the surface of the glass. So people said to me, well, every photo I took of the shroud was out of focus. And I said, that's because you're having to shoot through glass, and not just a thin pane of glass, but thick enough glass that the distance between the surface of the glass and the actual shroud is enough to throw your focus of your film, of your camera off.
Well, if I ever get to actually visit in person, which I absolutely have on my bucket list, I will figure out some way to take advantage of that. But
turn off the autofocus.
Yeah.
That's all.
That's it. That's it, exactly.
But you can't do that in a phone. It's built in, where that's why I still walk around with the big Nikon 35 mil style body, digital. And that allows me much greater control over, and I can turn the autofocus off and focus actually on the shroud. So again, look, I'm glad I'm retired, because otherwise I'd be competing with every human being on the planet that owns a telephone.
Yes, that is true.
A billion people.
True. Although I will admit a nice camera does do a good job. But let me just change the subject a little bit.
Go right ahead.
Then we had, I think it was 87 was the radiocarbon testing.
88, yeah.
The infamous picture, I've got it in my book, the 1260 to 1390 exclamation point. And so do you ever think that will be refuted enough so that the proponents of that test will actually believe the new test?
Well, that image you're describing, I refer to as the Three Stooges. And I always refer to the exclamation point after the two dates as a new form of scientific notation. He said with his tongue deep in his cheek. Look, the radiocarbon dating was obviously a major setback. And the folks who did the radiocarbon dating had a very intentional purpose in mind, and that was to use the shroud to promote their technology, which they have done dramatically well. So they were successful in what they wanted to do. Radiocarbon dating is a multi-billion-dollar industry now. So, and every time, even if it's got nothing to do with the shroud, if radiocarbon dating is mentioned, they always say, that was what was used to debunk the Shroud of Turin. Debunking the shroud is a fake, obviously makes a better headline than saying, hey, new science has shown that the radiocarbon dating was wrong. And we now have 6 peer-reviewed scientific papers in credible scientific journals proving that the radiocarbon dating date that they achieved could not have been accurate for any other place on the shroud except for the sample they took. And here's quickly why. They cut a strip. And if you look at the dates that were achieved along that strip, it wasn't consistent. It went hundreds of years from one end of that strip to the others. So how can you take any point of that uneven dated area and apply that to anywhere else on the cloth? You can't. Now, we didn't really know that for a fact because for 27 years, the 3 labs and the British Museum, which was the overseer and held all the data, refused to release the raw data, which is highly unusual in the scientific world. Once your paper is published, you can release the raw data because the scientific method says repeatability is important. So you release the data so other researchers can kind of try and see they can achieve the same results. That's a scientific method. That's how it works. And so and maybe the most ironic part of a gentleman named Tristan Casabianca, a French researcher, who's also a legal student, went to England and used the Freedom of Information Act and forced the British Museum to release the raw data. So remembering that one of the 3 labs was Oxford that did the dating on the shroud, Tristan Casabianca collects the data, brings on Emanuele Marinelli, who's a well-known shroud scholar for the last 40 years, and several experts in statistical analysis, and they evaluated this raw data, and they came to the conclusion there's absolutely no way that the sample chosen and the results from that sample could be used to date any other place on that cloth, period. And ironically, that article was published in a journal called Archaeometry, which is published by Oxford. So I always thought there was a certain irony that the radiocarbon dating comes out from one of the labs is from Oxford, and 30 years later, a paper in Archaeometry, a journal published by Oxford, disputes the radiocarbon dating based on access to the raw data. Now, the problem is Shroud is not a fake, does not make as good a headline as Shroud is a fake. So yes, it'll take many years. It's already taken, 30 years just for some of the media to now say, well, they dated the Shroud in 1988, but new data shows that maybe they were wrong. It's not exactly a definitive claim, but we're getting towards the point where people do recognize that there was, in fact, questions about that radiocarbon dating and its accuracy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I heard at the Museum of the Bible the other day, they did a presentation with Russ Briault and Joe Marino and 2 others. I can't remember.
Dr. Cheryl White and Father Peter Mangum.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So I watched that.
Look, 3 of them are board members of STERA.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we have to make Father Peter an honorary board member just so we can say all of them were board members.
Exactly.
I spoke with Cheryl yesterday. So.
Oh, fantastic. I've been meaning to reach out to her, but in any case, he mentioned his book on the kind of the refutation of the radiocarbon dating. So I'm very interested in I just got the book. I have
Joe Marino.
to read it. So I'm looking forward to that.
That's the Joe Marino book?
Yes, exactly. Well, I left it off my table.
Is that the 800-page one?
It is the 835-page tome.
Yep, it
Riveting.
Yeah, it's much more of a reference book than a narrative, but there is some narrative as well. And matter of fact, it's Joe who would probably be the next editor of Shroud.com. Something happens to me. And a lot of the material that you see showing up on each update of Shroud.com, Joe's the guy who digs it out and sends it to me.
Fantastic.
And he spent 35 years working at Ohio State University in the library. So who better than a guy who's an expert in the library to know how to find and research things?
Right.
So I'm very grateful to Joe. He's the guy who makes our updates as big as they are.
Fantastic. Yeah, a sharp guy. I've talked to him and look forward to interviewing him as well. So one of the other things that I find curious about the kind of, and I don't know if you'd call it the proof of the authenticity of the shroud or not, but a lot of people say, well, the shroud only first appeared in, I think it's the 1300s or so. And then from then on, there was a lot of exhibitions of it, and it was displayed and whatever and stuff like that.
From that point, it's documented up to this day.
Yeah, but documentation and is written, so to speak, but it would seem like some of the coins, like the Justinian coins and some of the other ones from the 600s all the way through the 900s, where the image of Jesus changes from, I don't know what you'd call it, a fictitious image to one that really does match the image on the shroud.
In the earliest days, the depictions of Roman emperors and Jesus bald with a laurel wreath around the head.
Yes.
And so artists have taken that idea and converted the laurel wreath to a crown of thorns. And that's the way artists have typically depicted the crown of thorns over the centuries.
Yeah.
And yet, in reality, the bloodstains cover his scalp. It wasn't a pretty crime. I mean, you couldn't tell a Roman soldier, hey, listen, before you execute this criminal, weave him a crown so he looks good up on that cross. You know, I don't think that happened.
I don't think that was the purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. They took a thorn bush and they smashed it on his head to humiliate him even further because he had proclaimed himself King of the Jews.
Yep. Yep. So where I was going, and I think you're kind of saying the same thing. To me, those coins that have so many similarities to the image on the shroud, those coins are kind of proof that it existed, at least in the 600s.
Yeah, and I think there's other evidence in the historical record. There's where Cheryl White would be. She's a professor of history, and that's my weakest part. But there are other points in history. There was a cloth called the Mandilion. Mm-hmm. It's not made by hand, meaning not an artwork, that ostensibly showed the body of Jesus. There was the Abgar legend where the shroud was brought to King Abgar, who was suffering from a disease, and it cured him. Although the Catholic Church has never attributed any miracles to the shroud, just as a point of reference. But those coins, and not just the coins, but if you go back to the early days of not the main Catholic Church, brain freeze here. At any rate, if you go back, the Orthodox Church, if you go back and look at that, you'll see iconography starting in about the 4th century. The famous one is the Christ Pantocrator, I think it's called.
Right.
And it's, I mean, you can superimpose one over the other, and they're so close that you can't deny that one was based on the other. And look, the first depiction of Jesus with a split beard that we see on the shroud is, I think, 285 AD in the Domitia catacombs in Rome, a fresco on the ceiling. And it shows Jesus, and it shows him looking like the man of the shroud. That's the first evidence, I think, we have of a depiction of Jesus that seems to be based on the image of the shroud. So there are places, but because there are gaps in that history, it's very easy for skeptics to say, well, you can't prove that. And, you know, from a historical point or historian's point of view, you need documentation before you can make those leaps of faith. And yet at the same time, there's enough information, I think, in the historical record that implies this cloth. Remember, this cloth kind of violates a bunch of laws anyway, certainly Jewish laws, right? Because it has blood on it, which means it must be buried with the body. And second, it has a depiction of a man that 1 billion people believe to be the Son of God, both of which are forbidden by Jewish law. So they couldn't come running out of the tomb saying, look what we got. They couldn't do that. They had to hide it, and it had to be protected. So where was it for 225 years until somebody obviously saw it and used it as a model for a fresco that they did? And the answer is it was probably hidden away and perhaps even forgotten for a period of time.
Right. I think that's exactly what happened. It was hidden away and forgotten. It got hidden away. The person died, and then nobody knew. And then all of a sudden it shows up again, and they find it.
There's an article, a couple of papers by a professional photographer from Turin named Aldo Goreski. They're on shroud.com. Look it up. Read his papers. He believes the shroud was rolled up and put in a clay jar, a tall clay jar, and probably put it in a room filled with clay jars off in the corner somewhere. And that's a perfect way to hide it in plain sight, basically. And he showed by creating a shroud and putting it into a container like that and allowing a little water to condense in the bottom, there are water stains on his mock-up that are almost identical to the water stains on some of the water stains on the shroud. So there's a pretty good piece of information there that points to the fact that at some point in time it was stored that way.
So just curious, the shroud itself, the cloth, is there a hem or is it a selvage on the end, or what is on the edges going
Yeah,
on?
there's like a seam or a selvage, I guess. I'm not an expert in textiles, of course, and there are others who are far more expert than I am that have written about this. And again, you can find this. I would suggest to anyone listening or watching, when you go to shroud.com, it's gotten so big that, you know, after a couple of years of building the site, I could not find things that I was looking for, and I knew I'd put somewhere. So there's now an internal search engine that only searches within shroud.com. So if you go to shroud.com and you're looking for something specific and you know how to use a search engine, which nowadays many people do, use the search engine on the opening front page of shroud.com, and I guarantee you'll find just about anything you're looking for and more of it than you probably want.
And I have done that. I've been all over that site. There is a ton of stuff there. So we're just about out of time, but why don't you tell us a little bit about STERA, the Shroud of Turin Research Education and Research Association, and what the mission is and where it is, and stuff like that.
Well, look, once I got to a point with the website, for the first 14 years, I was paying for it out of my own pocket, and my pocket got pretty empty. So it got to a point after I'd moved here to Colorado that I thought, you know, I can't afford to keep doing this if I don't have some external support. And as a self-employed guy for 50 years, I'm not used to asking people to give me money, okay? But I felt that it was essential. And the other thing is this, and I'm going to be very candid in this interview and say that there were some people, because I'm Jewish, thought that I was doing this specifically about money. And I felt that the best thing I could do to prove that was not true was to give up the ownership of all of it. So when I formed STERA legally, we got a lawyer and we legally transferred the ownership of the website, of all my photography and all the other materials I've collected over to STERA. So none of it goes to me. So if I were to die, STERA would continue on with our board of directors. They'd have to find somebody to replace me, obviously. And it would take about 3 or 4 people to do all the stuff I do, but they'd be able to do that. And that was a way of showing the world, if you will, that look, I'm in this not for the obvious reason. It's not about making money. For me, I felt that being in that room was a great privilege that I had been given. And I felt that that privilege brought with it an obligation, that I wasn't there for me. I was there for you. And because of that, I felt building this website, making this material readily available to everybody, free. Look, if we wanted to make money, we'd allow advertising on that website with a couple million visits a year. We'd be rolling in the dough compared to what we are. But I felt right from the beginning that advertising would be inappropriate on this site, even though many people come from the scientific point of view, many others come from a spiritual, religious, or theological point of view. And the last thing I want to do is have ads popping up in their face. So no advertising on shroud.com, never had it, never will. As long as I'm alive, it won't be there. But that also removes one revenue stream that any other nonprofit would, look at any other nonprofit website and there's, they're raking in the bucks with advertising as well. I don't want to do that. I want people to go to shroud.com and have the experience of studying this object. And as it says on that front page in the opening paragraph, given the facts, you have to make up your own mind about this.
Yeah, and that I think that's great, and I really appreciate that, and I really understand the mission and separating out the site from the monetary. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So wow, so thank you. I can't thank you enough. Thank you, Barrie. It was awesome. It's always awesome every time I talk to you, whether it's in this interview or by phone. I'm picking up things and I'm going, man, I wish I had known this. You know, lots and lots of good stuff. Really, really good.
Well, you realize we barely scratched the surface today.
I know. And I mean, you've got so much stuff out there on the shroud.com. I've been out there numbers and numbers of times. And every time I start reading, I have one question I want to get answered, and I read about 50 other ones, and I gotta stop because it's just so fascinating. So, well, but in any case,
I'm just going to say, do send me a link once you get this posted so that I'll put it on shroud.com so others can see it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We'll definitely do that. But also a message to the viewers, please absolutely go to www.shroud.com, and you'll then get to see all of the stuff that we've talked about, and that all the stuff that Barrie has researched and has come to his possession, and he's now got up on the Shroud, and I know he's forgotten more than all of us probably know. So really, but fascinating, really, really appreciate it.
Well, you know, being the editor of Shroud.com and interacting with all the top scholars in the world on the study of the Shroud, you're bound to learn something.
Exactly. Well, same here. I definitely learned something, and then hopefully for our viewers, they've learned something as well. So anyway, stay tuned for other videos in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And otherwise, please visit my site, guypowell.com, and then sign up to receive more episodes. Thank you so much, Barrie, and really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Truly my pleasure, Guy. Thank you, and congratulations on starting something good.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting my book out there. I don't know if it's going to be a couple of months or another or more longer, but it's close. It's close. So
everything in God's time.
Absolutely. So, all right. Well, then let's end it there. Wow, Barrie, thank you so much. I hope that was appropriate for you. And
hey, you saw, you just getting me started is easy. It's getting me stopped that's hard.
Yeah, exactly. I can be that way as well on stuff that I mean, stuff that's so near and dear to your heart, you could talk about it for hours.
Oh, I do all the time. You know, it's I teach a course at the Pontifical University in Rome. It's 24 45-minute lectures.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, I can do it. And, you know, look, you brought a guy on whose initials are BS. What do you expect?
Oh, man. Well, thank you so much. I had so many questions I could have asked.
Well, and you know what? Let's do another one sometime.
Yeah. Okay. I'd love to.
Yeah.
Round two. Well, give me a couple months. It'll probably be 3 or 4 weeks before I get this done and stuff like that. Sure. And then, but absolutely, I would love to. And I really so much appreciate your time, Barrie. You have no idea. And by the way, I'm absolutely coming to visit with you at the Museum of the Bible.
Oh, I'll be there. Yeah, God willing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly.
Now, look, how long do you think it'll take before you get this online?
Probably 3-4 weeks. I've got to get, you got to edit it and put it together.
No, I understand. And here's the reason I'm asking. I am anticipating the next update, the last update of the year, the one that where we do fundraising. We only do it once a year. We don't do it every time you hear from us, like most nonprofits do. We don't. Once a year, I remind people that if you make a donation by the end of the year, you can get a tax deduction for this year. Yep. And so we do an update toward the end. It's also an opportunity to wish people happy holidays and stuff. And that's going to happen around Thanksgiving. So if you can get it done and get me the link, even if it's just a couple of days before, I don't have a set date yet.
Yeah.
So, but it'll be somewhere later in November. If you can get that to me before then, that way they'll get to see it before the end of the year instead of in our January update, which will be our 26th anniversary.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And I will definitely do that.
Yeah, it gives you a deadline to work.
Yeah, that's always better. And
I live on deadlines.
Yeah, absolutely. So, wow. Well, thank you so much, Barrie. And I've got, so I'm doing a Sunday school class in a week and a half, and I'm going to unroll the picture you got, and I think I'm going to stun everybody. So I'm so excited about it.
Pretty sure you will. Well, listen. It's really a pleasure, truthfully, to finally face-to-face with you. We've spoken on the phone a number of times. But
it is.
But it's a pleasure to see you. It's a pleasure to see that we have some certain things in common.
We have the same barber.
Yeah, apparently. Well, I also have this.
Oh. No, I keep mine short.
Nah, I haven't had a haircut in 35, 40 years.
Well, I do my own now. I do my
Yeah,
own.
I do my own.
Yeah.
And I did trim up the beard a little bit. So I didn't want to look like Grizzly Adams. So I do trim the beard before I do one of these. But other than that, I mean, I did wear not a t-shirt.
Yep. Thank you.
You know.
Yeah, I
Well,
put a nice shirt on too. Normally, I'm not in a shirt like this either.
Yeah,
I'm more dressed like
I was
you
going to
are.
put on a dress shirt like that. And I thought, well, wait a minute, I have this. This is sort of better than a t-shirt, but not quite as formal as a dress shirt.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, considering that this was a more casual and less formal, if I were speaking in front of a group, of course, I'd be wearing that and a jacket, but no tie. I'm not a tie guy, even though I have a bunch of them. But I stopped wearing ties because they make no sense.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Although once in a while, so going to church, we're asked once in a while because I'm in the choir, and
Sure.
so we've got to wear a tie or whatever. But otherwise, I give up. I'm done with that.
You're in New York?
No, I'm in Atlanta.
You're in Atlanta.
Yeah.
But you sound like you're from New Jersey.
Very good guess. I grew up in New Jersey, and I have to say, I have to be very careful about how I pronounce New Jersey.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I'm from Pittsburgh, so I'm from that neck of the woods.
My wife is from Pittsburgh. She was, I think it's Mount Lebanon.
Oh, Mount Lebanon, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely not very. Matter of fact, my high school played Mount Lebanon in football.
What was your high school?
Wilkinsburg.
Okay, I'll ask her about that. Wilkinsburg.
Oh yeah, we played Mount Lebanon. We called it Mount Lebo.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, we did them, and tell you what, coming from Pittsburgh, I can hear Philadelphia, and I can hear New Jersey, and I can hear New York. And I asked if you were in New York, but I was really thinking New Jersey.
Yeah.
And you sound like you're from New Jersey.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's impossible to get rid of. Now,
well, I have a good ear too.
Yeah. Well, I lived in Germany for 6 years, and
so your German is you speak Deutsch.
Yes, yeah, ich spreche Deutsch, and but I was more or less fluent. That was 30 years ago, so I've forgotten a lot.
I was going to say, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But when I came back, and my wife came back, so we met over there, and when we came back to the U.S., we both had a kind of a German accent because it's so hard to get, and it took a while to really get rid of that.
Now, you were in Germany? Were you in the military?
No, but I was working for. I went over there first as an exchange student in Switzerland.
Oh, I see.
In St. Gallen in the Schwartz, and then I stayed over there for another 5 or so years up in Frankfurt, in Dusseldorf, and then in the Black Forest area.
I've lectured in Dusseldorf.
Okay, yeah,
in the Sankt Antonius Cathedral in Dusseldorf.
I'll have to look that up. I'll see how far that was from where I was.
Legionaries of Christ.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look that up. Fantastic.
One of their facilities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, listen, let me let you go, but wow, fantastic. I really appreciate it. And I'll send you that link here in a little bit, couple weeks, and then go from there.
Yeah, not a problem. You just send it by email and I'll incorporate it, because the way I do it is I list any new videos that have come out, but instead of putting them all on that one page, now I'm putting them onto a separate PDF. Yeah. So that if somebody wants to just do a bunch of videos, they can just pop out the PDF and click on the links to that instead of having to go digging for them.
Yeah, that's really nice.
And it means if the links break, it doesn't impact our page.
Yeah. Oh, that is interesting.
Broken links on an HTML page can lower your position on Google. Broken links on an external document, not at all.
Yeah, but do you get the backlink then? I guess you do in a way. So
well, basically no. I mean, we just link to any Shroud materials that are online. The problem is some of them are volatile and don't remain permanent. We've never taken anything off the website. We keep adding to it. Once something's up there, I've had people say, "Well, why don't you just take that down?" And I said, "No, because even if it isn't 100% relevant today, it was 20 years ago when it was first written. And historically, it's important to see that and to see the evolution of the science on the Shroud. So even if it's old and it isn't as scientifically viable today as it was when it was first published, it's still important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, listen, take care. I
All right, my
really,
friend.
really appreciate it. And we'll be talking. Thank you.
Take care. Have a great week.
You too. Thank you.
Have a
Barry.
good weekend coming up, actually.
Yeah, well, go Braves. They're in the next round here. So
go Steelers. What can I say?
And with that, I'm going to hang up.
All right. I'm going to hit the leave button. So take care and God bless, brother.
You too. God bless. Bye.
Bye-bye.